morning, everybody, and welcome back to the URBACT City Festival, Day 3. We hope you've been enjoying yourself these past 2 days of the online festival and hearing about the learning and transfer from our URBACT networks and the innovation that's been happening in cities across Europe. My name is Sally Kneeshaw, and I'm going to be the moderator of this opening session this morning. We're going to have a panel discussion on building back better in the post-COVID city. Does that mean default to business as usual or radical course correction? So we're going to be discussing a little bit about the impacts of COVID that we've seen across cities in Europe, how that's playing out on the ground and in our URBACT networks. And we're hoping to unpick some of this rhetoric around the building back better slogan. What does that actually mean? And how do we challenge ourselves to think about the actions that we could take and that are needed to actually take the opportunity that the pandemic has given us to place climate change and equality in particular at the center of the recovery that's now starting to be underway. So in relation to the Leipzig Charter that we talked about in the past couple of days, we're going to focus on the green city and the just city. And we also want to think a bit about how URBACT can add value in this process. The URBACT method focuses on integration and participation, and integrated approaches across departments, but also across territorial levels and levels of governance. So how can that help us when we start framing the recovery and delivering on it? And we also want to think a bit about the type of investments that could be made at city level with the funds that are coming forward at European level, the cohesion policy funds, but also the recovery funds, large amounts of money. How do we shape those investments well and combine the hard and the soft investments to make sure that we're making this recovery a good one, that's a just and a green city recovery? In terms of the format this morning, we're going to have a short introduction to set the scene about some of the issues that are at play in cities, some of the ways in which the pandemic has maybe changed life in cities and the opportunities we might have to make that better. Then we're going to go into a panel discussion. We've got 3 fantastic guests, who I'll introduce at that point, who are going to debate a little what that means in their work and what they are seeing on the ground across Europe and in fact globally. At all times, we want to get your comments in the chat, your questions and comments. So please use the chat in your hop-in. You can see it on the right-hand side of your menu. Ask us questions, we'll feed those back into the panelists and let us know what it's like for you in your city, what your priorities and what your concerns are in the recovery. We're going to start with a quick poll to see what your immediate concerns are. So if you could go to the right-hand menu to the poll, the Slido tab on your polls, and we're going to ask a first question in the Slido poll, which is a word cloud. What are the most pressing issues in the recovery for you? So if you could go to that tab on your hop-in screen and type in what for you are the most pressing issues in the recovery. And let's see what we're getting here. So up on screen, we already have quite a big emphasis on mobility. We've got impoverishment, local services, jobs, municipal finances. Please feel free to add more as we go. Equity is also, looks like equity is as big. Jobs, equity, mobility now coming up as the biggest themes on screen. And actually quite interestingly, COVID. Maybe the pandemic isn't over, so there is still going to be attention paid to the pandemic itself and how that we learn to live with COVID, as some of the politicians have been saying. So we now have municipal finances, economic difficulties. I think that, how cities finance the recovery, what money is in the pot already to start to pay for these differences and changes. Getting freedom back, retail, the green transition, gender equality has come up now. So quite a lot of really good ideas there about what are the most pressing issues, what's concerning you most at local level, climate mitigation too. So thanks for that. We're going to move on to the next question now. We could get the next question up on screen. So the next question is going to be about asking you if your city has a recovery plan. So does your city have a recovery plan? And you've got 5 options to choose from. yes, it's based on a well-thought vision and is a realistic plan. So that would be maybe the optimal. Yes, number 2 is yes, but it's very generic without a clear vision. Number 3, yes, but it's only related to get funding without a clear vision. Number 4, no. And number 5, I don't know. Maybe some of us don't even know if our city, at city level, we have a recovery plan. So if you could just give us an answer to those questions, that would be good. Let's see what we've got on screen. So a lot of people don't know. 50% of the answers are we don't know if we've got a recovery plan. So maybe one of the actions after this debate is to find out, go and ask your elected representatives, do we have a recovery plan? And what does it look like? What's in it? 24% have said no, there is no recovery plan. And in fact, the optimal answer, yes, it's based on a well-thought vision and is a realistic plan, is getting 13% of the votes at the moment. And then, so the 3 yeses where there are recovery plans, they're not looking too good. 8% is generic without a clear vision. Only 1 where it says it's related to funding. But actually 60% of people don't know if their city has a recovery plan. So that's quite an interesting finding in itself, that we maybe need to think more about ask our politicians about what's going on with the recovery plans. Can we move to the next question, please, Diego? And on the next question, we're going to ask you to evaluate the following statements in relation to the EU Recovery and Resilience Plan in your own country. This is the huge amount of money that's being agreed at European level, and I think Ivan will talk about this a little more, but there's a lot of money being agreed at European level in the EU Recovery and Resilience Plan. And we're going to ask you to number 1, rank this. Number 1 is totally disagree, and number 5 is totally agree. So first of all, the Recovery and Resilience Plan of my country has been developed in a process of open consultation involving also the local level. So could you answer if you totally disagree or totally agree, or somewhere in the middle with that statement? And let's see what's been given there. So it looks like number 1 is 53%, so very, very high score on number 1, totally disagree, and number 5, 5%. So we've got 24 answers already, 54% answering number 1. And perhaps we go to the next ranking question. If you could move to that. So we have most people disagreeing that the Recovery and Resilience Plan has been developed in a process of open consultation. And the next ranking question, same scoring. Number 1 is totally disagree. Number 5, totally agree. Cities in my country will be able to carry out their most important resilience interventions in the upcoming 4 years with the help of the money received from the Resilience and Recovery Plan. Let's see how people feel about that. Let's see. And we kind of got 46% in the middle there. So most people are answering right in the middle at number 3. Nobody's answering on 5, and some people are answering totally disagree. It's changing a little bit as we go here. So yeah, the number of people who totally disagree is growing to 32% now. It's evening out. So we've only got, I think, probably 1 answer where people agree that the money will help them in the plan, will help them to carry out the most important resilient interventions. So we wanted to ask these questions to see basically how much you felt that your city has a voice in the recovery and how the funds are going to be spent in the recovery, both at national and at local level. So that's given us some interesting answers already. And we're going to be coming back to the polls later on to find out more about what you think. But whilst we're talking now, please put your comments and questions in the chat too. So now we're going to get a scene-setting introduction from my colleague, Ivan Tosic. I'm very happy to invite him to the stage in a moment. Ivan is a thematic program expert for URBACT. He has a background as an urban sociologist, and he's also the director of the Metropolitan Research Institute in Budapest. And he's been listening, thinking over the years with our URBACT networks, but also throughout the festival to the debates around what's happening in cities and the recovery. And he's going to throw that together for us and give us some ideas and some questions around recovery at city level in Europe. So Ivan, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. In a few minutes, I will try to talk about the post-COVID city and building back better in the post-COVID city. But first, we should try to understand what the COVID city looked like. And you all know that during COVID, a lot of changes happened during more than 1 year. New patterns of employment dominate. More than 1/3 of people in the EU work from home in these days. The demand for mobility has been changed. Shopping became totally different than earlier. Residents wanted to look for safer housing. They wanted to have social contacts at all, and they tend to use public space more frequently. So all this highlighted a lot of existing contradictions of urban life and led to a total restructuring of patterns of work, trade, residence, and recreation. And this also resulted in a kind of demand shift. Probably most of you recognize that prices of suburban housing went up and prices in city centers dropped or at least did not increase. Uh, uh, the existing contradictions are sometimes highlighted in cartoons, and I like very much the left-hand cartoon, which shows how suppressed we lived in our cities before COVID. There were only very, very little places where people could walk in the city. And obviously, during COVID, this changed to the other extreme, and suddenly most areas in cities became occupied by active modes of travel. Now, what building back better would mean? It would mean transforming economies and societies into radically different directions, ensuring that post-COVID societies become more sustainable, inclusive, stable, and healthy. This would need strengthening some of the changes which happened during COVID, for example, active mobility, flexibility in work, but also fight other changes, for example, suburbanization and the fear of people from public transport. This should be fighted by the cities. And we don't have to forget that everything happens in a framework of multiple crises. Uh, Sorry. COVID is not the only crisis. This is very, very clear. It is, in fact, it is the third shock in the 21st century after 9/11 and the financial crisis. And it is also one of the existing chronic crises like environmental sustainability, the problems of the neoliberal economy, and the mounting social inequalities. And it is very important to handle these crises so that they take account of the other in synergy. So we cannot make steps which worsen the situation regarding the other crisis. I liked very much this picture from Kate Travers from yesterday. She was mentioning financial meltdown, climate breakdown, COVID lockdown, but we can also add terrorism, the financial crisis to this. So there's a whole group of crises at the same moment, and we can make a difference, obviously, from the short term like shock and the long term like chronic crisis. Now, if we are thinking about the new urban model, then we have to understand that density in itself is not the problem. It is overcrowding which is the problem. The unhealthy housing conditions which are the problem, not the issues that people are living in multifamily housing. If people have decent homes in multifamily housing where they can relatively separate from each other, then sorry, then the situation is not so bad. So this is answering the American researchers who at the first moment of the COVID crisis said very proudly that Los Angeles has beaten New York. No, this is not true, because density is not the most important factor. It is very clear that new opportunities are emerging. Demand for shopping malls, office towers, parking lots will shrink. Previously used places become vacant, mainly in city centers. This means that new functions can be brought back to the city centers. Affordable housing, small shops, new lifestyles around common places for culture, education. These functions were pushed out when real estate prices were very, very high in the city. There are some ideas already for post-COVID cities, and one of the ideas came already from earlier time, this 15-minute city idea, which means a kind of decentralization within the metropolis, having the neighborhoods in which you can find almost everything. And another idea is on a regional scale, the blended city, which means that we should not replace the physical compact city with a totally sprawled virtual city, but we should try to combine these two, having a compact city core and having good links to other parts of the region. In fact, we could have a third drawing here, which I couldn't find a good example of, which is the change in the inner city, because there must be a new model for the inner cities. The public sector has to find out something in the new situation where the prices of real estate are relatively low, office buildings are standing empty. If the public sector doesn't come up with a new idea, then it will be the market which will again change the inner city, and we should have alternatives for that. Now, what did the EU do? In fact, the EU had quite strong policies in the last years. The European Green Deal started already before COVID, a very strong determination for a fight against climate change. And then last July came the new idea, the Next Generation EU, additional 750 billion euros on the top of the existing multi-annual financial framework, help Europe to come out from the crisis and answer the crisis in a positive way. Now, I have some critical remarks, obviously, about these issues. The European Green Deal is a very strong policy, and one of the directives which is connected to that is the energy energy building directive, which means that that cities have to renovate housing. They have to achieve deep renovation, which means 60% energy saving, and this is a directive compulsory. And then Leilani Farha asked in a meeting Franz Timmermans, what happens if this directive will be used by large institutional investors going more green, but at the same time push out the tenants which cannot pay the higher rents of the greened buildings? And Franz Timmermans made an answer which is very clear. Much of this is not in the hand of the European Commission, but in the hands of the member states and municipalities. You need a system of governance, urban public authority with democratic control. This means that the European Commission can decide about green issues, but it cannot decide about social issues. So if a country does not make any social interventions, then the effect of the green interventions will be renovation. So this is a very clear conflict here, which has to be solved on the national level mainly. Another challenge is the Recovery and Resilience Fund. In fact, according to the answers of the cities, it is already clear that it was only a very, very small number of countries where the national level discussed at all with the cities. In most countries, the national government considered this money as the money of the national level, and they did not involve any other representatives in the decision of the plan. In fact, this is a different amount of money, and it is also, the procedures are different. You don't have to report about the costs. In the Recovery and Resilience Fund, you have milestones, and if you fulfill a milestone, then you will get the money. And it is not so bureaucratic than in the cohesion policy. This has also a lot of dangers. Obviously, many investors will go for this easier pot of money. It is very easy that it's very likely that implementation phase failures and corruption will occur. The European Court of Auditors is very much afraid from double funding and very much afraid of the low absorption capacity. Countries are not even able to spend the money which they have now. How will they be able to spend money in a good way if they get double amount of money? And which is an issue which is very, very worrisome. It is not even sure that the data about implementation will be accessible to everyone. There are already countries which said that they will not publish all the data about implementation. It is only, they are only required to give this data to the European Commission, but not to the member state, not to the stakeholders in the member states. So maybe cities will not have direct information about what the money is spent for. And it is not at all clear whether cities will be involved in monitoring committees. Now, this is my last slide. So how can we answer what should cities do to build back better? I think the cities can only build back better if they have a good links to the national and regional actors. So they should activate multi-level governance, because a lot of issues what cities want are not dependent on the decision of the city. For example, the educational system, housing, healthcare usually is on regional or even national level. So if the city wants something, it has to be in tandem with the other levels of governments. And there are already huge problems in this regard in many countries. The best allies of cities are the civil society groups and the residents in the city. So in this regard, the URBACT tools are very important. How can you activate your residents, and how can you envisioning for them a better future? And in this regard, agonistic planning, where conflicts are legitimate and lead to innovative ideas, are very important. You should not only tell what is your idea, but you should listen to the others, how they understand your ideas. And in fact, in this regard about the uncertain future, I think tactical urbanism is a very important thing. And we saw a lot of examples of tactical urbanism in environmental sectors to try out something, and either it becomes good and then you can keep it, or you change it. You could make the same kind of experimentation in economic and social issues, not only in public space interventions. So I think it is a very interesting task to build back better and to get a substantial share from the recovery fund. You have to fight your national government and you have to be strong. So thank you very much. This was my presentation.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for that sweeping view of the city in post-COVID and during COVID, and some really interesting issues that you've brought up there, particularly like around multiple crises, where actually it's a crisis on top of other crises, and we shouldn't forget that. Whole lot of stuff about density, about commercial space, about a lot of spatial kind of issues of the configuration of how inner city, outer city suburbs going forward. The need for critical analysis around the funds and the risks attached to the way that funds are structured at the moment. And I think that last point is really important one, especially for URBACT, around participation. That actually we've seen civil society and citizens do so much during COVID in terms of connecting, responding, supporting each other. A lot of stronger communities coming out of COVID and encouraging that level of citizen participation going forward. So thanks for setting the scene for us. We're now going to move into the panel section, and I'd like to introduce our panel guests. I'm very happy to have with us today three guests from different organizations at different governance levels. First of all, I'd like to introduce Aziza Akhmouch. Aziza is Head of Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development at the OECD, and she's going to bring maybe more of a global perspective to this conversation. It'll be really interesting to hear what she's seeing with cities across the world. Our second panelist is Laura Collini. Laura is a thematic program expert with a background in social and urban studies. And she's also been working with Urban Innovative Actions and the Urban Agenda for the European Union on housing and homelessness projects. So she'll bring a bit of that perspective to this conversation. And finally, Mrs. Janet Agren, who is Deputy Mayor of Umea in Sweden. And she has the portfolio of environmental policy. And Janet also is from Umea, which is the city leading one of the current URBACT networks, in fact, our first ever network that's focused on gender mainstreaming. So she's going to bring a very interesting perspective, and also about leading a city, feet on the ground, what it's like to be leading a city at this point in time. So thanks a lot to our panelists. I'm going to ask each of them in turn a couple of questions, then we'll open up. And we'd really like to hear your comments and questions in the chat. Let us know what you think about what Ivan just said, and anything that the panelists say as you go along, please feed into the chat and we'll pick it up. So first I'm going to go to Aziza and ask Aziza. Aziza, what do you think needs to be done? We've been talking about how this could be an opportunity to address the climate emergency, but what needs to be done in your view to place that climate emergency at the heart of the economic recovery?
Thank you very much, Sally, and congratulations for the organization of this very interesting session. I think there are three things that mayors have increasingly acknowledged over the past few months, learning from this pandemic, not so much as a revealer of new issues in cities and especially in large agglomerations, but more as a trend accelerator, as a sort of magnifying glass, really opening the eyes on the momentum to fix problems that have been lasting in many of these cities for a while. And those three issues relate to, first, acknowledging that this is not an either or situation, meaning economic recovery on the one hand and climate emergency on the other hand. Second, making sure that we understand there is now a tipping point coming and there's a clear time frame that requires urgent action and probably a good window of opportunity for doing that. And third, really going more and more specific in terms of the prerogatives of local governments, not only in terms of the policy areas where they hold critical competence, but also in terms of the investment that they manage, and that goes to climate and environment at large. On the first one, I think it's very important to recall that the climate emergency is not something distinct from the economic recovery. Actually, we've been saying at the OECD for a while that investing in climate means investing in growth. This was even the subject of a dedicated report we produced for the G20 presidency about 4 years ago, which showed that actually a climate compatible policy package could increase GDP by up to 2.8% on average across G20 countries in 2050, relative to a continuation of current policies, or even by 5% actually, when this is including the positive effects of avoiding climate damage. So this is a very important point because we've been stressing that climate investments in cities can actually create annual return of over 7 trillion US dollars in 2050 based on cost saving alone, while reducing by 30% urban emissions. The second point on the time frame is equally important because we can no longer afford a sequencing of one coming after the other. The two crises, this was very well said in the introduction, are concomitant. The climate crisis was actually there before the COVID-19 crisis, and it will be there after the COVID-19 crisis. And we cannot wait until we are actually done dealing with COVID-19 to fix the problem. And what I see is that with this pandemic, there's probably a window of opportunity with the combination of the Greta effect that was already there and raising awareness, and the Zoom effect that has probably changed a number of urban paradigms in terms of working, service delivery, accessibility, and that holds potential to reduce some of the agglomeration costs related to the environment, that maybe create a momentum that makes today a number of solutions way more acceptable than they were just 2 years ago. And the last point about what local governments can do, it's very clear that regardless of the institutional organization of countries, there are a number of policies that we know are discharged locally, whether they have to do with mobility or land use or drinking water and sanitation, solid waste, and name it, energy efficiency, housing, and so on. And cities have often been depicted, as being part of the problem, but also part of the solution. But interestingly, and that's why these recovery packages provide a good window days, a big chunk of the investment that goes to climate and investment and environment in OECD countries, and that's my last point, actually are discharged at the local and regional level. Over 64% of such investment goes through local and regional government. So I think with the two legs, the policy leg and the investment leg, there's definitely a scale and momentum for cities to accelerate the climate action.
Thanks, Aziza. That's a really comprehensive answer, and I like the optimism. That's good, where you feel that there is the momentum there. I think some of the things you said are interesting there were how we don't fix one problem at a time. We need to be actually addressing multiple issues for the multiple crises at the same time, not in a sequential way. And that's part of an integrated approach, I think, potentially. And also the interesting what you said about some of the solutions have become more acceptable quickly because of COVID. So there's been almost a leapfrogging of an acceleration of solutions being in place, especially around work patterns, maybe. So I just wanted to ask you if you could give us any examples that you have seen from cities around the globe who are doing some of the things that you've suggested and are taking action that would help to inspire others.
Yeah, there's actually a lot going on. We did a mapping of how 100+ cities across OECD's 38 countries have responded to the crisis, not only in terms of the short, quick fixes and low-hanging fruits, but also in terms of the more long-term strategies. And there are different actually angles. Of course, the sustainable mobility one and tactical urbanism was fantastic there with cycling path and other clean forms of urban mobility that I think are going to go incremental in the future and may also generate jobs and economic benefits. We've seen in Freiburg, for example, where cycling accounts roughly for 20% of the number of journeys within the city, that the costs of cycling infrastructure is actually just 1% of all the cost of the city's traffic and transport. So if you add to that the benefits in terms of avoided health-related expenditure, there's actually a very strong case for cities investing in transport infrastructure at considerably lower capital requirements than many other stimulus measures. We've seen also a lot happening in energy efficiency retrofits. And recently, for example, the city of Lille in France announced over 60 million euros of recovery plan. A big chunk of that is going to investment in the energy efficient renovation of 3,000 social housing units. So you bring the just transition into the conversation, and more than 3,600 private homes, but also 600 students residents for the next 3 years, which we know the youth has been particularly hit by this crisis. And this is all expected to also promote job creation, not only in the construction sector, but also in related sectors, and to support the transition to low carbon economies. We've seen also an uptake of electric vehicles as part of national strategies for clean transports. We've seen really many cities, Stockholm, Paris, Amsterdam, accelerating their electrification of urban mobility. We've seen Tokyo, investing in city level financial incentives for new private electric car buyers that may fix the environment issue that goes with the car dependency, but doesn't fix the public space issue and equity issues that also goes with the car dependency, which indeed the use of individual car in large, dense metropolitan areas needs to really become the exception more than the rule in the future. So there's a lot going on even beyond mobility. We've seen the port of Rotterdam developing a hydrogen ecosystem. We've seen the city of Marseille recently rethinking mass tourism and even promoting demarketing of tourism following the lessons from the lockdown. So I think really what is missing often in those local strategies, and that's my last point, is how we connect the dots beyond place-based specific or sector specific initiatives. And the SDGs for some of these cities, or new paradigms such as the transition to a circular economy, as we've seen working with Umea, provide the common language and framework to connect the dots and revamp really from the ground up how a city is planning, investing, strategizing and allocating budget.
Thanks, Aziza. There's some great examples there for us to follow up on and proof of concept that cities can do this. One of the comments that's come through in the chat is that your comments and what you're saying are actually really good selling points for mayors who are resistant to these kind of investments related to climate change and the green transformation. That was from Jenny Kutsumarka. Thanks for that. So we're starting to get questions and comments in the chat. So thanks for that. We're going to be coming back to you, Aziza, but I'm going to move on for now to Laura Collini, my colleague who's a thematic program expert in URBACT. Laura, given the work that you've been doing recently on housing and homelessness, can you tell us what you feel the impacts have been on housing, homelessness, and also maybe a little bit about sustainable tourism? Aziza just mentioned, I like this idea of a tourism demarketing that's happening. So tell us what's been going on in the cities that you've been looking at. You need to unmute yourself, Laura.
Yes. Thank you, Sally, and good morning, everyone. In terms of impact on housing and homelessness and tourism, I think the impact of COVID is evident, has been impacting unevenly. And also we've seen that is pre-existing patterns of discrimination, hierarchies, inequalities along the lines of gender, racial inequalities have been created and recreated because of the loss of jobs. Just to make some example, in Spain, There are data analysis that incomes drop around 45% among the young population. But also we know that there are specific groups that have been more impacted by COVID more than others. If we look at the data of 60% income and 40% pension gap among women and men, you understand very easily that the housing crisis has been impacting more women than men, and also in terms of domestic violence and many other issues that are related to that. We also know from data that there was an interesting analysis conducted by Inside Housing in UK that put together a statistic on mortality for COVID and overcrowded housing, showing that there is a real linkage between inadequate housing and COVID deaths, for instance. We also know that the homelessness has been rising steadily. Before the crisis, FIANZ has been calculating 700,000 people sleep rough every night in Europe. And this data, although there have been measures to stop that, they haven't been extremely successful everywhere and in an even way. Another important point that I think some of the previous speakers have been speaking about is that the pandemic has shaped new needs and new desires for larger homes, for more outdoor spaces. And so that also prompted developers to invest in different types of housing and not necessarily at the reach of the most vulnerable people. And so this has also some worries in terms of what is the market doing and what the situation at the moment that we know is changing. We know in certain places that rents have been keep on rising. In other cases, there has been a stop in the amount of raising of the cost in terms of buying homes and purchasing homes, but the situation is very unclear. Reuters recently has written a report in the fear about the bubble in the real estate sector. So all these things are very much changing and creating a worrisome, I would say, situation to a certain extent. But at the same time, as everyone knows, we have been seeing mitigation policies that have been a result of, as well as the pandemic, the sort of re-centralized decision-making from cities to government level in terms of emergency. So we have seen a lot of measures like bans of eviction, rental freeze, a reform to financial support schemes to support renters, deferral of utility payment, and so on, which are good and positive, but at the same time, we have to say that some of these bans have been still ongoing. Eviction have been still ongoing. Amnesty International denounced that the Roma people have been still evicted during COVID pandemic in Italy. Recently, yesterday, I think The Guardian published an article by Ado Colau saying that the statistic in Barcelona calculated that 11,000 individuals and families have been evicted in Spain during the first 3 months of this year. So, which is the very high level. So, on the positive side, I would say that this measures, the mitigation measure to a certain extent have been extremely progressive. Social movements, activists have been sort of campaigning for this, like Stop Zero Eviction campaign worldwide, for instance, as well as a rent control and rental cap. And the pandemic somehow shows that it's possible to implement that. And if I can continue in speaking.
Actually, I'm going to stop you there, Lara, because we're starting to get a lot of questions in the chat, which I want to make sure we've got time for, which is great. So thanks so much for that. I think, you know, there's some really good data, important data for us to look at there about what's actually happening in terms of income, which are the most vulnerable groups, at-risk groups, and taking account of that in the recovery plans. But I'm going to move now to Mrs. Agren, Janet Agren from Umea, with a question for her, the Deputy Mayor of Umea, who's actually having to lead a city through the pandemic and into the recovery. So Janet, we wanted to ask you a bit about, first of all, a bit about gender mainstreaming and representation. Laura just talked about some of the statistics around what's happening with women being maybe disproportionately affected through the pandemic economically and practically. So what do you think we can do to make sure that we have gender mainstreaming in recovery plans and the kind of investments that have been talked about already?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. And as said, as a local representative and from a city perspective, I think whether we manage to build back better will depend on the choices we now make when rolling out our post-COVID-19 recovery plans. So it's important that we do the right choices. But we have a unique opportunity, as said, to rebuild more efficiently and more inclusively, and to ensure women's participation in the economy and addressing income inequalities. But we actively need to work with these questions. So we believe that gender equality work needs to be globally understood, but always locally contextualized. So the work with the recovery plans must also be based on understanding the working actively with gender equality, both quantitative and qualitative is a good investment. Because it gives you a critical eye, it opens processes and foster innovation. So we believe it can save your organization both time and money by making interventions specific and efficient. But it cannot be an afterthought or an add-on. It must be there from the start. So when it comes to our own work in the city, we don't have a separate recovery plan. Instead, the investments and the actions for recovery that we're now taking, we try to integrate within our ordinary budget and planning process, and that follows our strategic plan for the municipality and the vision of where we want our city to be by 2030. So it is important to have a gender perspective in doing this, and the choices we are making, they are based on an analysis of the local context. But of course, for us as many other cities, we are highly affected by the pandemic in many ways, and for us. The pandemic has brought our attention the vital functions in our society and the essential workers, which, as you said, to a large extent are women. And we have been made aware during this year, even more than usual, I would say, of the indispensable work carried out in female-dominated sector to ensure the primary functions of our society. So this has made a mark now on the budget for the coming year. And the planning process. So in our case, we have chosen to relocate more resources to these sectors in the municipality, but also some more funds to the green and digital transition.
Thanks, that's really good to hear that you're, on the basis of that data, you're reallocating, adjusting the way that the city spends its resources. So that's a really good example at city level. I'm going to ask you a question, Janet, about this ability to tackle more than one issue at once. And if you think there are key actions that you're taking, for example, in Umea, to connect gender equality and climate actions, for instance, is there a way that we can be more smart about tackling several things at once? And then after that, I'm going to go into some of the questions that are coming in from the chat for all the panelists.
Okay, well, first, I think understanding that gender is an important perspective when designing measures and the actions taken to address climate change, I think. And when we look to our city through the data we have from different surveys, no matter it being a consumer habit survey, travel habit survey, or if we're looking at the sharing economy, we can see different patterns connected to gender. But we also know when it comes to climate and behavioral changes that it is difficult. It's not easy since it's connected to power, to identity, to norms. So I believe recognizing this and develop the organizational skills to work with these questions is as important as introducing new technology. And one example that is connected to this, if we look at the travel patterns before COVID in our city, we can see that women are more likely to choose sustainable modes of transport. So we have already, for a few years ago, made a huge investment of only electric buses in the city. But for the city to reach its goals when it comes to sustainable travels, we need men to behave more like women and go by bike or walking or go by buses. So we must do the investments, but also work with the behavioral changes. So that is really important now when the society opens up again. So we are strong believers when it comes to co-creation and working together, because it's when we make sure everyone is part of the conversation and the truly innovative ideas will take form. So we try to integrate, we try to highlight the importance of integrating an understanding of gender equality as a central part of the work with sustainability. To make sure it really becomes by and for the citizens. So this requires constant examination and evaluation of the way we communicate, gather information, and carry out measures. So last, I also would like to say that we depend on the European Commission and the different European funding programs to help us see the connection and to recognize the fact that building a green and just city must be done simultaneously. So we are therefore, of course, very grateful for to the URBACT program and for bringing the connection between gender and sustainable urban development. So and to the forefront, and giving citizens and other stakeholders to the opportunity to really explore this approach and learn. So for that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet. And that was, I really liked some of the examples you gave there. And this one about the hard and soft investments, the hard investment in the electric vehicles, but the soft investment in actually changing behavior patterns. This is what we really need to be thinking of going forward. So we've got a little bit of time left, and we've got some questions coming in from the chat. Thank you for those. I'm going to present the questions and then ask people to answer quite briefly, because we are running out of time already. Two questions, particularly for Aziza. One is one of the big opportunities here the chance to reset our obsession on GDP and growth? And the second question for you, Aziza, is how do you see the role of policy coherence for sustainable development at local level? That's from Isabel Ripa. Then there's a couple of other questions that I think we could probably put together and maybe ask Janet and Laura to respond to. And it's about the scale of cities. One of them is from Maria Joao saying, where do small cities stay, especially in interior and rural areas, in the middle of this jungle of literature, tools and resources through structural funds? And many of the time they do not have the capacity to access these. How do we overcome that gap? And a question from Hans Schlapper, similar, saying these examples are about capital and major cities. What about the majority of urban settlements that are not globally connected? So that maybe you could respond to those. And finally, there's a question from Peter Austin about will cities need more investment and more money to build back better in the pandemic? So I'll go to Aziza first, and then to Janet, then to Laura. And if you could keep it, we're running out of time, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to keep you brief. Yeah.
I'll go fast. Indeed, that's absolutely true. And actually, the Better Life Index of the OECD, which is precisely aimed at going beyond GDP and putting on the spotlight the multi-dimensional nature of well-being that looks at different material and non-material conditions, dates back to 12 or 13 years ago. So this idea that we should not pursue growth at any cost, we should make sure that that growth is inclusive, that the dividends of prosperity are evenly distributed across different groups, and that it's also green, is something that indeed has been mainstreamed more and more in policy making, including at the local level, and that requires absolutely to go beyond GDP metrics, which is why we are assessing the distance of cities and regions to the SDGs. We are assessing the extent to which they meet those well-being criteria and so on. And I think the implications for cities on that front is really, are people living in cities because they want to, or because they have to? And in the have to means they have to go for jobs and for productivity at large. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really changed a bit the paradigm on that front. A quick word on policy coherence for sustainable development, to say this is a huge challenge at the very local level. There are very practical trade-offs mayors have to struggle with. You know, public space, do you go for green amenities or do you go for housing? And the shift towards more multifunctional infrastructure, I think, is helping manage some of these trade-offs, and using frameworks such as the SDGs, you know, where you make sure you're not advancing a goal at the expense of another, but rather have a systemic and holistic framework, I think can help manage those competing demands for limited resources or space in that case.
Thanks, Aziza, and it's really good that you mentioned the SDGs there. Of course, that's another one of the tools in the repertoire that we can be using to help with these kind of difficult trade-offs and decisions. You're quite right. I'm going to go to Janet next to see if you could answer the question about the smaller cities, then to Laura, then we'll maybe come to Ivan for some wrap-up comments.
Well, thank you. I think, as mentioned about small cities, it can be difficult because you need the funding to make the changes, but still you have to work with the preconditions that you have. So even in our case, we're not a big city, we are a medium-sized city, but still we try to do the best with the possibility we have, and we always try to network with other cities to learn what can we try to implement in our own city. Because the good thing with small and medium-sized cities is it's closer to the citizens and to other stakeholders, and then it's also easier maybe to have the conversation on how to do the transition. If you look at these super big cities, they have a very challenging thing to make the transition. But I think if you look at the small cities, of course, there's the thing with funding, but you still have a good opportunity to start the transition. I also would like to say, as Aziza mentioned, I think the question of well-being should be at the center. So looking at the SDGs, and I also think the EU Social Progress Index can be a help if you want to look at what's important for the citizens.
Thanks, Janet. Laura, some comments from you?
Yes, I'm thinking that in terms of demography and size, obviously there are many differences, but in terms of policy, sometimes it's not so evident. Like, for instance, good examples of impact of or post-recovery after COVID, I think are very good when you have long-term policies, and this does not change if you are small, medium-sized cities or large cities. An example is Odense, that is a part of Roof Network, for instance, and they had long-term policies on housing first, and they have seen the drops of homelessness by 40% in 10 years. And other cases in good examples is the city of Barcelona, but it can be applied anywhere else. They change the support to homeless people, especially for women, because the shelter have been designed according to male-oriented spaces, let's put it that way. And so they reconfigure the public services in a way to accommodate the specific needs of special target groups. And this can be done also in small and medium-sized cities. And in terms of additional money, yes, money is always needed, but the way is how you invest that. And the frame is that of acting in terms of social rights. Because if we say in terms of housing, for instance, European doesn't have a mandate, but it has a mandate on implementing social rights with the European pillar, for instance, and other measures that are now put in place. So it can be done.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for that example of what a smaller city is doing. I'm going to come to Ivan in a minute. Just we had a clarification in the chat about the question on more investment and services. Would the money be needed for investment or services? Which is more needed? And Ivan, there was also a question which maybe you can address or in your feedback, which is from Donald Herlihy. Cities are always facing crises. Whatever type of crisis. So could cities be using more scenario planning techniques like commercial organizations have done successfully to respond better? So are we using the right tools to respond to crises generally is part of the question there. But Ivan, I'm going to give you like a minute or two to just give your reflections.
This is a good question, the last one, and I would be happy if cities would be able to use scenario planning, not only react on the next crisis, but this would really need a kind of multi-level government approach, because a city can think about reducing mobility in the car mobility if the congestion charging is not allowed by the national government. So cities can have a lot of ideas, but they don't have all the possibilities to make decisions. So in fact, cities need, I think, more decision-making right in their functional urban area. And they also need more money, because energy retrofitting is really a costly business. So cities would need more say in cooperation with other levels of government, and they would need more money to go on with the most important needed development. In fact, I think that cities are lost in some countries where the national government don't take them serious and doesn't speak with them especially with oppositional cities, but also in general with cities. So cities are still, they still trust the European Commission level and the European Parliament that would say that national governments, this is a one-off opportunity. This is like a Marshall Plan, this money what we have now. Don't spend it only according to your own wishes, but look what the local level would need and try to help them to fulfill their idea. So I think this kind of pressing of the European level, that the European level should press the national governments to be more open to multi-level governance cooperation. This would open up for scenario planning, and this would open up for a lot of good things, and then we can build back better.
Thanks, Ivan. Good conclusions there. We're coming to the end of the session. We have a few, maybe 5 more minutes, and I'm going to post a poll at the end of the session for people to do at the end. So just to round up, I'm going to ask our 3 panelists as well to maybe come in with final remarks or messages to City, if you could, about what you think we could be doing to build back better, starting with you, Aziza.
I think there is one thing we have not touched upon today, which is that for a long time we've been thinking cities in terms of our relationship to space. And I think what COVID-19 has opened up is the possibility to rethink cities in terms of our relationship to time. I think this accelerated experience with the digitalization at large, not only teleworking, but online services, etc., has made many of us aware that maybe we're no longer compelled to all be doing the same thing at the same time in the same place, including getting into, traffic and overcrowded transportation to get to the office at 9 a.m. And I think this will hold huge implications, this chrono-urbanism that we need to revisit for efficiency and effectiveness in our cities of the future.
Thanks, Aziza. Laura?
Yeah, I think the title "Building Back Better" it's kind of problematic because building back it's not possible, and I don't know if better it's enough. I think we need a radical change, and a radical change in terms of economy as well, and how production and reproduction of wealth and is created as well before then distributed. And it has to do, if we go back in terms of housing has been turned into financial assets at different levels, from the family to the global level. And so to reclaim the housing as a common good is the basic step. And everything else, I think, is related to this aspect of making this a social right.
Thanks, Laura. And Janet?
Use this opportunity, as previous speaker said, to try to make the city and the society better. And as a city representative, I believe the municipality or the city administration has a unique possibility to see the bigger picture on the local level. So that a few other stakeholders has the possibility to do. So don't lose this opportunity and do the best you can.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists. I think that's been a really rich discussion. Thank you also, Ivan, for setting the scene and helping us to think what all the different elements that need to be brought together at different levels of spatial terms as well. So we're going to go to a poll now, just to finish the session. We're going to go back to the poll tab, the Slido poll tab on your screens. And the first question we're going to ask you is, what changes would you like to see in a post-pandemic city? If you could, this is again a word cloud, you could type in your answer, having listened to those panelists today, those interesting voices, different perspectives. What would you like to see in a post-pandemic city? And I'll be able to view in a minute what you're putting in there as your inspiration and your answers to that. So the kind of things we're seeing are affordable housing, more equity, happiness. That's nice. Happiness. I would like to see a human being in the center of sustainable development vision, not only in the mouth of position on different levels. More soft mobility, social justice, green mobility, more equity. Equity seems to be a very strong focus here, which is great. Answers to climate changes. Non-motorized cities, non-car mobility, affordable housing again. More space for young people. I think that's a really interesting one too. More space for young people and the youth. More solidarity. Okay, maybe we could go to the next question. On a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you that your city will build back better, with 1 being the least confident and 5 being the most confident? So let's see what your confidence levels are about the way that your city is planning to build back, and will it be better? Given, well, Laura's whole critical analysis of that whole phrase, building back better, we'll use it for now, but with the caveats that Laura has also given us. So at the moment we have most people scoring it a 3. So somewhere in the middle, 43% are sort of not so confident about how we'll build back better. Okay. So thanks everybody for participating in the polls. Thanks for joining us this morning for this opening session of the last day of the City Festival. I'd like to say thank you again to Ivan, to Laura, to Janet and Aziza for joining us and for bringing such really interesting perspectives and a combination of different views to the debates. Thank you so much. I think it's now time to close. And for everybody on board, please head to the reception area in Hopin and choose your next session. Still lots of interesting activities to go today and the last day of the City Festival. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks a lot. I think it was